Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Gunther. And thank you again for the invitation and the sponsorship from Euroscript and so on. It's great to be here. Some of you were here yesterday, right? Yeah? Fine. I'm not going to repeat myself, but the first part of what I will discuss today will be quite familiar to those people who have unfortunately been hard at work translating my book, because it will come from the book. But the second half of the talk does not come from the book. And maybe there are bits also in other places that don't come from the book. And today I'm going to try to be more practical than I was yesterday. In one sense, anyway, because I was very interested at the end of yesterday. Some of the translators stayed behind to talk about the problems they'd had translating. And one of the questions that we discussed was whether translation theory has the intention to be helpful to translators. And I said that I thought most scholars working in translation theory consider that the application of translation theory to translation teaching and to translation is probably only a secondary priority. For some people, it's a first priority. But many scholars, including me, I think, who study translation, are studying it for its own sake because it's so fascinating. We would like to know more about how the brain works when people translate. We would like to know more about translation history, about how translators have affected culture, how interpreters work in wartime, and a great many other things to do with power and agency and culture and all kinds of things. And only later do some people think maybe our research should be helpful for translators too, or for people who are teaching translation. So what I want to talk about today has relevance to two aspects of why we want to do translation theory. One aspect certainly is people have developed the kinds of things I will talk about to try to help translators and to try to help teachers of translation. But the same kinds of concepts and typologies which I will talk about have also been of interest to purely descriptive scholars who are not teaching at all, who are interested in trying to find ways of analyzing existing translations. How can we analyze the kind of solutions which translators arrive at? And what can we learn from this? So there are two kind of hats which we have to wear. When we wear our teacher's hat, we are up here, and the translators are down there, and the translators are saying, "Oh, please, Mr. Theory, tell us what to do." And we say, well, you should do this and do that and don't do that. And we've discovered that this is a good idea and that's a bad idea. And we are the authorities. But we have another hat, which is when we, the theorists, are down the bottom, and we're looking up at the translators, and we're saying, gosh, how on earth do you do that? How did you arrive at that solution? It's brilliant. Or, that's a strange idea. Where did that come from? And we are wondering at you. Can you see the difference? They're two very different attitudes. And you will see both of these attitudes behind the talk today. Sometimes I will be this, and sometimes I will be that. Maybe I should have brought two hats. I didn't remember that. Okay. We start with some important assumptions which both hats can accept. So the first assumption is, and these are called assumptions because we don't question them. They are not hypotheses. They are things which are so obvious that we don't need to wonder about them. So translation has to do both with similarity and difference. This is obvious. Okay? But something follows from this, which is quite interesting, and some modern scholars have made a new word to describe this, because if translation involves both similarity and difference, that is to say, translations are in some way similar and in some ways different from the original. That suggests that translators actually do two different things. Part of the time they are spending trying to make similarity. And part of the time they are spending deliberately making differences for some reasons, as we shall see. Okay? When you do not want to be similar, but you need to do something different. And one word that some scholars have begun to use is equivalencing as a verb. Now, I didn't like that when I first saw it a few years ago. To equivalence. I'm going to do some equivalencing. I'm going to equivalence this morning. It doesn't sound very good in English, but maybe we should try to get used to it. But the idea is that translators do spend part of their time equivalencing, trying to create similarity, and part of the time not. Now, as soon as we make this distinction, interesting research questions arise. I now change my hat for a minute, because it would be interesting to know how much time do you spend equivalencing, and how much time do you spend, shall we say, differencing. Terrible word, okay? But I think you will understand what I mean. And if there is a difference between, if people divide their time in this way, is it a division which all translators share, or do some translators spend most of their time equivalencing and other translators spend most of their time differencing? And what about editors? Do editors also spend the same proportion of their time equivalencing and differencing? And what happens when you revise? When do you revise to make more similarity, and when do you revise to make more difference? We don't know the answers to these questions, but they are questions that researchers are beginning to think about. And maybe you yourselves have some ideas on this we could come back to. Another assumption, the last point on this slide. When you aim to create similarity in one way or another, presumably this is deliberate. This is what translators are supposed to do. You're supposed to find some relevant similarity or equivalence, people say, between the two. What about the differences? I think that some differences might be deliberate, that the translator might make a difference from the original deliberately for certain reasons. I'll give you some examples a little later. But of course, other differences might just be unconscious. They might come because of some other decisions that are being made. So the researcher would like to know, when are the differences deliberately created by the translator, and when are they the consequences of other things which the translator is doing, which are maybe not deliberate? Quite interesting. So, what we are going to focus on today is really the differences. What are the typologies that have been proposed for analyzing the kinds of shifts or differences or changes which translators make? And the first thing which we have discovered in the last 50 years or so is it's very difficult to agree what to call these things, whether we are teaching or simply researching. It's not quite clear what we should call them. And should we only be talking about the changes and not worrying about the similarities? Or should we have some kind of a typology which includes both the similarities and the differences? Before I go on, I'll just say one thing which I said yesterday, which I should have said today as well. You will have all these slides afterwards. They will come to you by magic technology, with Helena's help here. So you don't need to write everything down. You can get them later. Okay, what do we call the changes? What do we call the differences? One of the first ideas was shift. We'll call them shifts. Catford suggested this in English. Of course, other languages have their own decisions to make. What do we call them? Other people talk about procedures or strategies. I have used strategy myself a lot, and I think perhaps it's not so good now as I thought it was when I first started using it. People who talk about strategies make a distinction between global and local. So a global strategy is a decision that you make about the general way you're going to translate a text. Are you going to make it sound deliberately strange for some good reason? Or are you going to adapt it so that it simply doesn't sound strange at all as far as you can? A local strategy would be something much more detailed. What do I do with this particular verb here? Shall I use this strategy or that one or that one? Different ways of translating a particular verb or word. Then there are scholars who talk about techniques. Other people talk about operations. What do we call them? We need to agree on a word for these things. And these, at the moment, I think it might be quite good to choose a very neutral term, like a solution type. The last proposal I will talk about today uses the term solution type. It's the most recent proposal, and maybe that's why I have been influenced to use it. But whatever we call it, we're probably talking about the same concept, or are we? At the bottom of this slide, you see some of the differences between different scholars who have tried to understand, or they have made proposals about how best to understand the different changes and solutions that translators come up with. For example, should we be talking about the process of making the decision and choosing a certain strategy? Or should we be talking about the result of such a decision? Some people talk, if you talk about a procedure, it's a bit like you're talking about something that you do, okay? When you come to such and such a problem, you do this and this and this, all right? Whereas if you talk about a shift, it's a bit more like a result. We look at the source text and the target text, and we decide there has been a shift. There is a difference of some kind between the two, formal or semantic or whatever. And nowadays, I think, there is an agreement that we quite like to be ambiguous, rather like the word translation is ambiguous between translating and the text that you produce when you have done some translating. So this ambiguity seems to remain still. Another difference we have been arguing about is, should we be trying to understand these different textual solutions as things which happen in the mind? Are we talking about the translator's cognition, or are we talking about language? Are we talking about differences or similarities between two texts? And some scholars take one line, others take another line. And I'm going to take the line, and I think most scholars do take the line, that it's easier if we talk about texts, not about the mind. Because at least we can see a text, we can see a difference, we can observe it, we can observe a similarity. But it's very difficult to actually see what's inside somebody's head. Not impossible to some extent, but pretty difficult. And the last problem, or the last difference of opinion underlying the whole of this research debate in the last 50 years is, are we talking about what translators do when they get stuck, when there's a problem, or are we talking about what they do in a routine way, what they do all the time anyway? What is it that we're trying to understand? Now, this raises a question, and I will ask you what you think about it. Research in the way translators think as they translate suggests that there are two processes going on in the mind. It's as if the translator in process one goes along very smoothly, and you do everything in an automatic, routine kind of way, using your intuition, using your common sense, and so on. And then all of a sudden you stop. And there's a problem, and you say, whoops, what do I do with that now? What's that word? I can't remember it, or the first thing that comes to your mind doesn't work, or something. And there's a kind of hiccup, like that. And then you solve it, or you postpone it, and you go along, and it's very smooth. And there's another hiccup. You know that feeling? Is that how you feel when you translate? It's not that you're doing this all the time. It's kind of jerky, like that. Okay? This seems to be a very widely shared research result. So we have two questions that we can ask. Which is the most useful question? Do we want to know what happens at the hiccups, or do we want to know what happens in the routine period? And is it true or not true that when you get better and better and better as a translator, there's more and more routine things and fewer hiccups? Is it true that learners have hiccups all the time and no routine things? Well, the answer is not quite. The professional experts have hiccups in different places, which is really quite interesting. And we can learn from where the professional hiccups are, and we can learn something about what makes an expert an expert. And we can try to teach students to cope with easier hiccups. That's actually not today's topic, but still. So I've underlined the word problem here because what I will talk about today has to do mostly with what scholars think is a useful way to analyze solutions to the hiccup bits, the problem bits, not the routine bits. Okay so far? So, the rough idea, which is really the kind of the basic idea of this whole talk, is that if you get stuck, change something. Do something different. Which is, I suppose, a useful advice for life, isn't it? If you're stuck where you are, change your socks or do something different anyway. For example, move away from a literal version. Now, this also brings in assumptions. Scholars are always interested in assumptions. Because from assumptions, if you can be explicit about what is assumed, you then can be more careful about what we can guess, what we need to guess about, what questions we can ask. So the assumption here is that there are two basic methods, literal and non-literal. Not exactly true, but maybe not too bad an assumption. And the second assumption is that we tend to try a literal version first, which is what I was talking about yesterday. You may remember, those of you who were here, the literal translation hypothesis, which is very well supported. Not totally supported, but very well supported. So, I'm reminded here of a notice I saw in a translation agency in Helsinki, set up many years ago now by some students of mine, about advice to the translators working in the agency, what to do if you get stuck. And they had 3 pieces of advice to offer. And I wonder, do you agree with these? Or would you put them in a different order? Or would you give different advice? Here's the notice. If you get stuck, ask someone. If that fails, translate literally. And if that fails, now, is that good advice or not? Is that what you do? Agree? Disagree? Yeah? Anyone disagree? Go on, dare to disagree if you do that. You agree. You disagree. So what would your advice be? What would you change?
Now I'm stuck.
Why not?
I mean, I've worked at home as a freelancer. Find someone to ask would be a special task.
If you work completely alone, you run the risk of breaking the first ethical principle, which is never translate alone. Because you might make a mistake that somebody else would see. Sometimes I have advised my own students, if they are working as a lone freelancer, to set up an agreement with somebody else who's a lone freelancer. No money, I'll check your text and you check mine, and we can just help each other. That's probably quite a good idea. But okay, yeah, you ask if you can anyway.
Well, I meant before you give your work to someone else, like peer translator or editor, you need to translate particular bit you have stuck with, and you have to translate it yourself.
You have to propose
first.
something. Yes, I see what you mean. Do you use email lists? I mean, people do, don't they? What do I do with such and such a word? And you send it out to the world, and you get 25 answers the next morning in your email box. Do you try that?
Well, actually, one thing I do now is I search. Internet provides many answers, and then that is a lot of information you can process.
That's true.
And that is, in a way, asking someone.
It is, isn't it? I think that's like asking.
In this sense, yes, it is asking.
Agreed. Okay, so we really can agree on that. All right, good. I quite like the last one. If you can't translate literally and nobody will help, then leave it out. Of course, that depends what it is. You can't take a risk if it's really important. You can't leave it out. Now, these, of course, are not textual solutions. These are what you might call sociological solutions, things to do. Now, let's now move on to actually what happens in the text. Come on, move on. There we go. So, when people begin to think of this as a research problem, so the research question is, how can we analyze the kinds of textual solutions which translators use? People develop different sorts of typologies. Some are very simple, as we shall see, and some are more complex, and some are probably too complex. And as people develop a typology of different types of solution, then you realize that there are some important distinctions that you have to make so that your typology works. And one of the first realizations was the distinction between obligatory changes and optional changes. Now, obligatory changes are the changes that you make routinely because the languages are different. If you're translating from Finnish into English, you have to remember that English actually has articles, things like the and well, Finnish doesn't. So you have to put them in, as probably you know. So that's obligatory. And because it's obligatory, it's not interesting to translation scholars. It's interesting to contrastive linguists. Look at languages which do have articles and those which have one article or 17 articles or no articles, and you can learn things about differences between languages. But they're not really to do with translation. So it's the optional ones which translation scholars are interested in. That is to say, they're interested in solutions where the translator has a choice, where the translator could do something else. This distinction is not always completely clear because in the middle between the two, you have all kinds of changes where some translators would say, that sounds really bad, I think we should do this. It's pretty terrible if you don't change this. And other translators would say, well, actually, it's not too bad. I think I could accept it. And there will be disagreements about what is compulsory and what is not compulsory. But on the whole, I think it's a useful distinction. Now, one of the very first typologies was Naida's. This is the beginning of the 1960s. So it's a long time ago now. Naida is the grand old man of modern translation studies, one of the grand old men, I should say. He spent his life teaching Bible translators. He was a devout Christian and worked for the American Bible Society. And he was a linguist who tried to develop ways of training Bible translators, whose job it is to translate the Bible into all kinds of strange languages, some of which didn't even have a written form of the language. And he proposed that there are 4 kinds of change which you can make. You can change the order of the elements, you can change the structure, you can add something, or you can omit something. That's very, very simple, really very simple. And in his system, it was a bit more complicated because some of these are given more weight than others. Adding something and omitting something are rather bigger changes than simply changing the order of something. So they get more weight. And some people have found this has been useful. I think Bible translators have used it for generations. I think nowadays people would say it's not detailed enough. It's too general. We need something more specific. What does it mean to change the structure, for example? In what ways can we change structure? What kinds of omission can we distinguish? What kinds of addition? Where do we add? And so on. So it's a bit too general. And as we shall see, some of the later proposals have been more complicated. Now we can look at this from a teacher's point of view. If we are teaching translation and we wish to teach our students a basic set of translation solutions, how complex can that set be? If I came in and said, right chaps, I've worked out the perfect typology for translation translation solutions. There are 437. All you have to do is to learn these by heart, and then you have to know when you apply number 203, when you apply number 149, etc., and your problems are solved, and then you can become a millionaire. But probably that's rather too complicated. But nevertheless, the belief is that if we can teach our students some basic set of solution types, then these would be very useful tools, because it would help the student to go past the hiccups. Because when the student arrived at the hiccup, the problem bit where the student is stuck, the teacher believes that the student will then be able to say, okay, I've got my solutions. That one? No, 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 no. Yes, possibly. And you run through them in your head, the different types, and you pick one out quickly, and off you go. Well, is life like that? To some extent, perhaps, but perhaps not. But teachers like to believe that these solutions, this basic set of solutions, could become conceptual tools. If you ask a carpenter to build you a bookcase, the carpenter has some wood and a hammer and a saw and other stuff he needs to, and he builds you the bookcase. If you're asked to do a translation, these are like your hammer and your nails and your saw. These are the conceptual tools that you use to solve problems. So a teacher believes all we need to do is to give the students these tools, and we can do this quite quickly, and then the students can go off and be wonderful translators. Yesterday, somebody asked me in the later discussion, what about people who are very good translators, even if they have never been trained in any way, never been to university? Where do they get their concepts from? Where do their tools come from? Is the only answer intuition or common sense? Maybe it is. Maybe concepts don't help everybody, but maybe they help some. At least teachers need to believe this, because if we didn't believe this, what would we teach? All we would then do would be to say, translation exercise this week, here it is, and you do it, and it comes back, and you get feedback, and here's next week, the next one, back, feedback, and here's the next one, in and out, and so on. Well, maybe that's a good way to teach, but many teachers would say that's too boring, that we need some analytical framework to be able to allow the students to generalize. A certain sorts of problem came up last week, and you chose such and such a solution. Maybe you can use that same solution this week, and so on. So we need some shared conceptual vocabulary that we can use in order to teach. This is the teacher's view, okay? And we believe that this would be also helpful for the translation students. This is a very common metaphor that's been proposed. It's like learning to drive. When you first learn to drive, you've no idea where the brake is or what to do with the gears or anything else, and you have to learn this, particularly, consciously. You probably remember. I remember teaching my daughter how to do this in the countryside. It was quite fun driving along the country roads, and she was trying out different things, what to do. What happens if I do this? Don't do that, don't do that. So, okay, but then gradually it becomes automatic, and then you don't think about it, unless there's a crisis, and then you have to do something very, very quickly. Well, this is what we would like to believe, that the solution types are going to be useful. But the next question then is, how many solution types can I teach? If NIDA's 4 is not enough, it's not specific enough, and if I propose 459, or whatever it was, and the students say, I'm not learning 459, it's totally impossible, then what's going to be a good number? How can we decide on this? Well, the numbers get bigger and bigger, and then they get smaller again. Let's see, as you will see in a few minutes. Okay. Now, perhaps the most influential typology of all over the last 50 or so years, more now, 60, 70 years, has been the one proposed by two French-Canadian scholars way back in the end of the 1950s. And they called these things procedures, and they had 7. I think you could remember 7, right? You could probably do 7. And it's been very, very influential, I must say. And many teachers have found it very, very useful. And other people have thought that it's not so useful, and it's too narrow. So I'll just show you what they are, and then I can ask you what you think. Do you use it yourself, I wonder? I imagine that many of you, especially if you have been through a university training, you will be familiar with these, especially if you've read the book, my book. Okay, first choice, the first solution type is a loan word. So you're translating a Finnish text, and the word sauna comes along. Oh, what do I do with sauna? I don't have a word for sauna in English. What shall I call it? I know, I'll use the Finnish word. And so you use the Finnish word in English. As you know, it is also an English word, borrowed from Finnish. Probably in Latvian too, all right, I should guess? Okay, so you have also you've come to the same conclusion. The Latvian translators, hundreds of years ago, decided not to call it something else, but a sauna. They made a decision, and there it is. Okay, easy. Second choice would be a calque. A calque is a borrowed structure, not a borrowed item, one item, but a structure. One of the most famous examples of this is if you are reading Nietzsche. I'm sure you are reading Nietzsche, aren't you? And Nietzsche's theory of the Übermensch, the overman. Okay, what do we do with this in English? Übermensch. We don't know what to do. So we invent a solution, and of course this is the origin of Superman. You've probably heard of Superman. What is the Latvian for Superman? Supermens. Okay, so it's kind of partly, it's a calque, but you have adapted the second part of the calque to Latvian morphology, but not the first part. It's not Supermensch or something like that. Well, how was the first one changed? Okay, so both parts have been adapted. Okay, interesting. So it's a kind of adapted calque. What? It depends on well, yes, it depends. That's an answer I heard yesterday quite often. Okay, yes. All right, but that's what a calque is. So it's their second choice. Their third choice is translate literally, which means as close as you can without actually producing something which is ungrammatical. And here comes a division. And this is where they do something which some scholars have disagreed with, and some teachers have disagreed with too. Because what Vinaya and Albanese say is that basically the first thing to do is to try one of these 3 solutions. And if they don't work, then you can go further down the list. And as we go down the list, we get further and further away from the source. The differences get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the assumption that they make, Vinaya and Albanese make, is that the good translation, the best translation, is one which does not go further down the list than it has to go. If you make more changes than you need to make, it's too free. Good idea or not? Because there are many teachers who think that this is a very bad way to teach translation. Why would it be a bad way? Because it would encourage translators to translate literally. It would not encourage them to translate more freely. And I know teachers in Finland who think this is a terrible idea, and that actually we should start by getting translators to translate whatever they're doing very, very freely, and then in the revision process, bring it back a bit closer to the source. So start by being radically different, they say. Don't start by being as close as you can. Now, there's a research question that comes in here. I changed my hat, okay? Do we have research which does an experiment on this? Here we have one group of students over here who are taught to make the first version as free as you can. Make it sound really natural. Now, over here we have the people who are following Vinaya and Dalbane and starting with something very literal. And do we find that this group or this group produces better translations? Don't know. Give you one strange example. You know Sigmund Freud, no doubt, not personally, but still. German chap. Okay, writing in German. When he was first translated into English, for the very first time, his works were translated by an English psychoanalyst who had a very interesting method of translating, which is totally not the method that Vinaya and Dalbane were encouraging. What this translator did was to read, first of all, read the original German paragraph, not the sentence, but the paragraph, half a page, and then put the German aside, and then wrote in English what he thought the paragraph was about, freely, and then checked to see whether he'd missed something. Now that's doing what, which side was it? Was it this side that we're going to start with the free translations? I forget which side was which. That's what he was doing. He was starting with something very free in order to completely cut himself off from the possible effects of interference from the form of the original. So teachers who think that this is a good way to translate would argue that if we follow Vinaya and Dalbane, we are really making interference more likely, which is a risk. But we would like to know empirically which is the best way. We don't know. I wonder what your opinion would be. But I'll go down the list first, and then we can have a discussion on it for a moment. The next one now, when we're beginning to make changes, okay? This I have found very useful, I must say. Change the word class, okay? So if you've got a verb and you're stuck with the verb, you can't think of a verb, try and change it into an adjective or a noun, see what happens. My students have found this a very useful tip. Then there is changing the meaning a bit in one way or another. And the word modulation has become quite a well-known term in translation studies, as has transposition. They have become technical terms because of the way they have become popular after Vinaya and Dalbane's procedures. Modulation means changing a little bit of the meaning. So, for example, take one here from French. In French, they don't have a word for shallow, shallow meaning not deep, okay? There's no word in French meaning not deep. You have to say little deep, peu profond. Completely, I mean, the French, well, you know, the French, never mind that. But if you translate shallow into French, that's what you have to do. You take the opposite, profond, which means deep, and you put peu in front of it, which means little. So you kind of changed the way of looking at the idea of being shallow. I expect you could think of a million other examples with Latvian and other languages that you are familiar with. So, can you change the meaning slightly? The next one down is to change the structure. It's what they call équivalence. which is a really bad term because we have equivalence with quite a different meaning in translation studies, as you know. So it was very silly of them to choose this word to describe this particular procedure. This is what you use for idioms, as I'm sure you know. Probably in Latvia, it doesn't rain cats and dogs like now. It rains something else. I don't know. What does it rain in Latvian? From a bucket. Okay. Okay. In English, as you know, it rains cats and dogs. I don't know why, but it does. So you probably don't translate into Latvian that it rains buckets of cats and dogs or whatever it is, but you just have the bucket. Blimey. It is raining, isn't it? Okay, so in other words, you change the whole structure. Just hold on to the meaning. And the last one is what they call adaptation, which again is not perhaps a very good word because adaptation has been used in translation studies for very free translations in general. Naidoo has wonderful examples of this. One of his famous ones is what do you do when you're translating the Bible into the Eskimo language, the Inuit language, where of course there are no sheep in Greenland or Alaska or whatever it is you are, but there are lots of seals. Seal is what is the Latvian for a seal? You know the word? Okay. So the Lamb of God in the Inuit Bible becomes the seal of God, which makes sense to them. And there are many other examples like that you can think of. So this is a deliberate difference, of course. You are moving away from the lamb, the fact that lambs, sheep are all over Palestine. You're moving the whole of the biblical story to an Eskimo environment because you want your people to understand it. I suppose Jesus would wear different clothes and he would do different things. And you have to change a lot of other things as well, wouldn't you? Probably lives in an igloo and things like this. But okay, if you want to translate the Bible in this way, a lot of other things follow. You adapt very, very strongly. I remember another example from between French and English this time. And this is... no, from English to French, that's right. And the English source text says something like this, that there's a family who have some reason to celebrate, and so at supper they have a bottle of wine to celebrate. Okay? And it's a big thing, a bottle of wine, wow, with our supper. And you put this into French. My anti-French, I love French culture, but I make out, for some reason or other, I seem to be making jokes against the French this evening. But of course, the French drink a bottle of wine 3 or 4 times a day, so it's no celebration to have a bottle of wine. So in the French, in order to adapt to the French culture, you have to say, for supper we had un bon bouteille, a good bottle of wine, rather than any old bottle of wine. That's adaptation. Okay? You're making a difference from the original in order to fit with the target culture. Okay, so just to recap where we are, try the first 3, say Vini and Albane. If they don't go, move to one of the more indirect ones, one of the freer ones, and go as far down the list as you have to go. If you go all the way down to adaptation, and you could have found a good solution at the level of transposition, then you've gone too far. Now, is that useful or not? How do you feel about that? Let's just have a pause for some comments before we move on, because this is probably the most famous typology that's so far been proposed. Does anybody use this? Do you have this above your desk? Nobody? No? Would you put it above your desk? Would you find it useful? You might? Oh, okay, good. Would you always start from the top? Yes, it would depend. And I think also it would depend on frequency. Loans and calcs are pretty rare, actually. And if you put them where they're not good, the result is a mess. I think they have been a bit misleading in assuming that a loan and a calc is as important as transposition or modulation. Those two in the middle, transposition and modulation, I think are really very important. They perhaps are the most important of all here, I think. I would go for those first if your instinct doesn't suggest something already automatically. Can you fiddle with the form slightly in this way, changing the word class, and can you change the meaning a little bit? Of course, sometimes or often, if you change one, then you change the other. If you choose a total structure change, you're probably also changing the form, not just the meaning. So it's not that they're all separate. They tend to occur together when they do occur. Any comments or questions on this very early typology? Still very famous. Yes? Schreiber, what about Schreiber? What does he have?
Because Schreiber has, on the basis of this typology,
yes?
has his own typology, and it's a little bit more detailed.
Yes, I think this is the typology that has influenced the last one I will talk about today, because Anthony Pym, whose work I will come to a little bit later, he has been very influenced by Schreiber. His book talks about Schreiber, and I think he has used some of Schreiber's ideas in the last one that we will look at today. But when they were writing, I don't know, when did Schreiber write? This is after Wien and Albany, right?
I think Schreiber is after.
This is 1958 or something, 59? Surely he was after that. I think he was later. So they would not be influenced by him, but maybe he would be reacting to them. I don't know. It's not clear to me how much of this work, which was originally written in French, was available outside Canada for a time. Then it was translated into English, and many English scholars began to use it, and it's been quite well discussed since then. I don't discuss Schreiber's work here. I'm not actually familiar with it, but I think it will come up in the background of the last proposal I will make from Anthony Pym's. Thank you for raising the name. Let's move on then. I come now to my own proposal, which was more complicated than Wien and Albany's, because this is a proposal that actually has 30 strategies. And when I developed it, I thought that my students would be able to use it by remembering the numbers of the strategy. And I used to give them translation texts where I would mark certain points in the text, and I would say, you know, try number 17 here. You know, it might work. Or try number 22 here. And they would gradually maybe try them, and then they maybe liked this, and maybe they got used to the idea of thinking in terms of these strategies. Some of them were very similar to the ones we've talked about. I'm not going to go through them all here, but I will talk about some. I had three groups because I thought that three basic groups are quite helpful. That you change the form, or you change the meaning, or you change the whole message, or a part of the message. I thought this was fairly easy for students to remember. So if you're changing the form, it might mean changing the word class, or the structure, or the cohesion, or the rhetorical scheme, like the rhyme pattern in a poem, or something like that. If you're changing the meaning, then you might have this antonyms like profond and shallow we had just now, the opposites, using terms which are more or less general, or paraphrasing, or expanding, or modulation like we had just now, changing the point of view. And then there were the pragmatic ones, which I will illustrate in a moment. But before I illustrate them, I think that now, if I look back 20 years later, these strategies, which I called them then strategies, I think they were probably too complicated to be useful. I think there are too many of them. And I think that some of the categories I use are not well defined enough to be applied. So if I went back again, I would probably have to think a bit more carefully how they should be done. But I want to give you some examples of these pragmatic ones, because the pragmatic ones involve making bigger changes. And this also links back to something else we were talking about last night, which is the way in which a translator's knowledge of the theory can influence the way a translator translates. So, some examples. Let's take, what were these? So, I first of all said, well, you can add or omit things. These were two of my pragmatic strategies, as neither had, and there were examples in the book, so I won't go into those just now. Then there is explicitation, which we talked about a little bit yesterday, but for those of you that weren't here yesterday, I will give some examples here now from some work of my own. Some time ago, I was translating a Finnish novel into English, and there were several points in this novel where something was said in the Finnish which a Finn would understand, which I thought would have to be explicitated in English. This is an example of a deliberate difference. Not perhaps an addition, because I'm not adding information to the text that was not there in the Finnish, because for the Finns, this information would be implicit. Let me explain how this example works. This is a novel that was written about 10 years ago. And about 2 years before the novel was written, there was the World Skiing Championships held in Finland. And there was a huge scandal because it turned out that the Finns were discovered doping. Okay? Many Finns had cheated, which was a national scandal. Terribly embarrassing, disaster, absolute terrible. And in the novel, you have two characters who are looking out of the window of their hotel. They're in Italy, and it's winter, and they're looking at Italian soldiers actually skiing. They are practicing. They're looking down, they're seeing the Italian soldiers skiing there. And one of the Finns says to the other, they're not really skiing very well, are they? And the other Finn says, actually, I don't think we should say very much about skiing at the moment because, because of the embarrassing scandal that there had just been. Okay, now, when I got to this point in the novel, I thought anybody reading this in English is not going to know about the doping scandal at the skiing championships in Lahti 2 years ago. If any Finnish reader will know this, because it was so embarrassing. So it's not information which is not there, it's information which is, in the Finnish, implicit. And I have to make it explicit in English, which I did, by adding this little bit in yellow, which is not there in Finnish. Nothing corresponds to it in the Finnish text. And then, for interest, I looked at the German translation, because this is a novelist who's been published in German. The Germans have a very rich translation market, much richer than English. Stuff gets put into German and never goes into English. And I noticed that he also thought, at this point, that he has to explicitate. But he's done it slightly differently. He has just said, a bit in yellow, after the experiences of recent years, I thought that we shouldn't actually be criticizing other people's skiing abilities. So he has explicitated a bit less. I have been a bit more explicit than he has at this point. But we have both agreed to explicitate. So we have both agreed to make a difference. Now, it's well known that translators explicitate in general. It's a very common tendency, as we discussed yesterday a bit. And if you know this, it may be important to balance your text by sometimes implicitating. It's a horrible word. I hope you get what it means. That is to say, you make something implicit because you think that your audience will understand it without it being said openly. Finnish, in some cases, is explicit, and you decide that you don't need to be explicit, you can make it implicit. And I think this is an example of where I personally was very influenced by my knowledge of the theory. I knew about explicitation. I knew that if I explicitate whenever I have to, and if I never balance this by implicitating where I can, then there's going to be a kind of a stylistic imbalance in the text. And I decided that I didn't want that imbalance. I wanted to try and have it as even as I could make it. so that there was a bit, not obviously too much explicitation. And so I went looking through the text for places where I thought I could implicitate. I could leave something out, where the Finnish had not left it out. Something where I could assume that the reader would understand what I was saying, what the writer was saying. Here is an example. There is a boat now. We're in Italy, in Venice, and the main characters are on a boat, and the boat has got stuck on a sandbank. The tide is going out. They're in a little rowing boat, and they're stuck, and they can't move their boat until the tide comes back in, and then the boat will float again. And they realize that they are stuck in this boat for 3 or 4 hours. And if you are stuck in a boat, a gentleman occasionally has to have a pee. And it's described at several moments that one of the characters hears somebody peeing over the side of the boat. Excuse me for this example, but it's quite a good example. Okay? And the Finnish says, the boat rocked, and there was this trickling sound of water, and it was the American having a pee over the side into the water of the lagoon, says the Finnish. I thought, why do you say that? It's obvious. You don't need to say that. And so I implicitated it. And I did not write into the water of the lagoon, because I think that makes it too specific. It's said too much. You are underestimating the ability of the English reader to realize, obviously, it's the water. There they are, stuck in the lagoon. Where else is he going to be? I mean, don't say things that you don't need to say. You get the point. Now, I think that's quite interesting. In literature, I think that's quite important, that it shouldn't be too explicit. That if you can implicitate, then try. More examples of these pragmatic strategies. Okay, quite big differences, you could say. And one of them would be to domesticate or foreignize, depending on which way you want to do it. In English newspapers, when there is some mention of the Russian Duma, it's usually translated as the Russian Parliament, which is a domestication. If you put in an English newspaper, the Duma voted yesterday, many readers wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about, I'm afraid to say. Some newspapers would have a double translation or a double strategy, because they would say, yesterday, the Duma, brackets, the Russian Parliament, voted to do this and this. They would be trying to educate their readers, giving both the loan word, the loan solution, the Duma, and a domesticated version, the Russian Parliament. And often that's a good idea, to put both in. So you have two strategies at the same time, a multiple translation. There could be formality changes too, such as different ways of showing politeness and so on. There could be trans-editing. Is that a term that you use, I wonder, or not? That's become quite well used in translation studies by people who study textual changes. This is a word that means radical improvements, quite big changes, changing the order of paragraphs, big adaptations, kind of halfway between editing and translating. Some people find it a useful word. Then there could be adding a footnote, if that's permitted, if that goes according to the norm, could be a useful thing to do. That would be, for me, an example of a pragmatic strategy. And there are a few others. Now, with all these categories, there are problems. And I've mentioned this one before. In many of the proposals, including mine, I think, there are too many categories to be useful. They're hard to remember and hard to apply. And here, I have to say, hard to apply with both my hats on. If you've got 30 strategies, maybe that's too complicated for a teacher and a student. And it's also perhaps quite complicated for a scholar who wants to analyze changes. Several people have used this list of 30, but they have often adapted it slightly, made it a bit simpler as they've used it in their own research. A more important problem is, do they work for all languages? Now, Vinay and Dalbane were working between English and French. And when I was thinking about my own strategies, I thought mostly of the languages, or I thought entirely of the languages that I know. English and French and German and Finnish mostly. And most of the examples were with English and German, because I thought there would be German readers who would find that helpful. However, I know no Japanese, and no Korean, and no Chinese, and there's a million languages, well, not a million, thousands that I don't know anything about at all. And it may be that the kind of categories that we're using in the West, in these languages, this rather small group of languages that have been using these terms, maybe they don't work for African languages or Asian languages or so on. So they would need to be tested. And one of the results of this testing is a new proposal, which is this one by Anthony Pym. And I want to pause on this for a bit to comment on it. I think it's one of the most interesting, and it hasn't actually been published yet. He's written a whole book on translation solutions, which at the moment is being checked at the publishers, and I suppose it will come out next year. But he's given me permission to share with you his own proposal, which comes in the last chapter of the book. And I want to go through this for a few minutes with you and comment on some of his decisions here. This is the guy who's been influenced by Schreiber, among other people. This is the proposal I was referring to a few minutes ago. And on the left, you see that he has divided up your basic options into 3. So that's quite simple, that you either copy something, or you change the expression or the form, or you change the content. That, I think, is quite helpful. In the middle column, he says these are the solution types, the main big types. And he argues that these are the things to be taught. So like Vinay and Dalbane, he's got 7. Okay? He reckons that students can remember 7, and even teachers could remember 7. Okay? And they are those ones given there. Now let's just look through these a minute. Before we do so, yes, on the right, you see examples of what they mean. And Pym's point is that if you stick to the 7 in the middle, the actual examples on the right they are probably an endless list. There are endless ways in which you can, for example, introduce a perspective change. But the important thing is to remember what happens in the middle, and then the examples can be whatever you like. So the first type is simply copying, which reminds us of loan words and calques from Vinay and Dalbane. Copying structure. Okay, I'm not entirely convinced that copying structure is a problem-solving thing, but still, that's a bit of a query. And then he has this thing that he calls perspective change, which is all the kinds of transpositions and modulations, which we've mentioned before with Vinay and Dalbane, where you change the word class, change whether you're talking about small, deep, or shallow, change the voice, active to passive, and many, many other sorts of changes, where you simply look at the different perspective. For example, buying and selling. I bought it from her, she sold it to me. Sometimes you have to make a change like that, what they call a converse. Look at the whole operation of buying and selling from the other point of view, depending on the language. Then you have density change, which is the way he describes making something more general or more specific or more explicit or implicit and so on. He uses the image of focusing. He says when you change the density, you are either focusing in, zooming in, and you get more detail, more explicitation, or you zoom out and you get less detail, or less explicitation, more implicitation, and so on. So the perspective change is the angle that you're looking at, and the density change is how close you are looking. This is the difference, the way he explains the difference. Multiple translation, for example, we just mentioned. the Duma, the Russian parliament thing. Then he puts in something which he calls compensation, which is to move something to a new place in the text, maybe, or into the notes, or even into a paratext. That's interesting. Have you ever thought of writing a translator's preface to something you're translating and explaining or giving solutions to translation problems in a paratext, not in the text itself, but outside the text? Of course, that won't apply to a great many texts, but in some texts, that might be a possible solution. Cultural correspondence for idioms and things, and the whole range of different ways of translating cultural specific items. You could make a whole sub-typology of different ways to do that, and many people have done that. And then finally, text tailoring, which is what he calls trans-editing, which is where you make radical changes to the text. Of course, you can't do that all the time. You wouldn't do that with literature. You certainly would not do that with legal texts and so on. But you might have to make corrections. You might have to bear in mind censorship requirements, depending on the ideological situation in your country, and so on. Pim says that he has tried this list out with students coming from lots of different languages, including Chinese and African languages. He has taught in many different places, including South Africa at the moment. And he claims that this list of terms in the middle are general enough to be applicable to all the languages which his students represent, which is quite a good claim. He's really tested these, and I think that's a very good thing to do. But on the right, of course, the list of possible ways in which you might change density, or change the perspective, or compensate, or translate, try to aim for cultural correspondence, this list is pretty much endless, I think. He adds a number of comments on his typology. He reminds us that he's only concerned with optional changes, and he has this rather nice picture which goes back to where I started talking about at the beginning of this lecture. I talked about having the hiccups. He says, if you're just translating in a routine way, using your instinct and a dictionary and so on, you are cruising. And every now and again you hit a bump. And these are the solutions he suggests that you could consider when you hit a bump, when you get stuck, when you have a hiccup. So he makes the same difference between the routine and the problem bits of your translating. He then says something interesting, which many of the other typologies, including mine, did not specifically make, which is that he aims that his typology should be useful for teachers and learners. And it's not supposed to be helpful for scholars who are analyzing translations. Many of the others, for example mine, was supposed to be useful both for teachers and for scholars who want to analyze existing translations to discover how they work. But he underlines the fact that his version is, his view is purely pedagogical. So therefore it would be tested, not by scholars analyzing translations to see what generalizations you can make about how people translate, but they would be tested in the classroom. Do teachers find it useful? Do students find it useful? If his typology is used in a class, and at the end of the class people are translating better, and they think that it's because of this typology, then that would be a good way to test it. Of course, they might be improving for other reasons as well. It would be difficult to set that up as an experiment. Then he makes an interesting claim, and I wonder if this is true, my brackets there, the square brackets. He says, or he suggests, that he thinks that all types of solutions are possible for any kind of problem. Now, I wonder about that. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I've had a number of master's students in Helsinki who have done quite interesting master's theses by starting with a problem, for example, how to translate metaphors, or how to translate names, or how to translate slang, or whatever it might be. Okay, a general problem. And then they have used something like my strategy typology, or some version of it, and they have tried to see, tried to analyze what are the solutions that professional translators, published translations, tend to use to solve ways of translating metaphors, or ways of translating names, or ways of translating whatever the problem might be. And they have sometimes come up with quite clear frequencies, so that a slang, the most common option is this one, or for this kind of slang, or this kind of name, or this kind of metaphor. This is the first choice. And then only then other ones come later. So I think there may be correlations which is for the scholar to discover and then to share with teachers and students, that maybe there are correlations between certain problem types or subtypes and certain solution types. Do you see the argument? So here I don't quite agree, and I wonder, we just don't have enough research on this, but it would be interesting to know if it would be possible to say that tell me your problem type and I will tell you the most common solution. That would be quite a good position to be in. One could put this into a computer and we could all go home and have a drink. And life would be much easier. But I'm not sure that we will ever quite arrive at that. Then he makes a couple of interesting points having to do with how does the translator decide which is the best option, the best solution? If it is true that all the solutions are possible, which is a question mark for me, but maybe anyway several are possible, how do you decide which is the best one? Well, Pim suggests that the best one depends on your effort. How much effort are you prepared to put into choosing a solution? Because the ones at the top of the list that we had, the copying and just changing the form, they are much easier to use than the ones at the bottom, he says. So this is a bit like the Vinne and Darbelne argument, that the ones at the top are closer and the ones at the bottom are further away. And it's harder to find a good solution if you go further away. Well, is it? Interesting assumption there. We might have to test that. So you choose the solution which saves you time and money. But you have to relate your use of time and money, your effort, to risk. This is Pim's view, that clearly you need to be careful when you think you must really invest more effort, because this is a really important word or sentence or structure, and it might take you a day to find a solution, but it's so crucial you simply have to spend time getting it right. Whereas somewhere else in the text, it may be trivial, and you could not worry how brilliant it was, and you could just take something second best and don't waste your time on it. So for Pim, what would be important is knowing which are the bits of text, the sections of the text where there is a very high risk, a risk of breaking the communication, or a risk that you lose the trust of the client because you say something completely stupid, and therefore you don't get asked again to work. So you have to bear this in mind. And I think that's a very important practical point when we think of all these solutions. The solution that you choose has to be balanced against not only the time you spend finding a good one, but also the degree of risk that you are guarding yourself against. The last point he makes here is that if you find a solution which the reader will expect, it makes life easier for the reader. But I won't just... Me or you? You? Okay. Maybe it was me. Never mind, sorry. I'll just leave it. Sorry about that, if it was my phone, which I've forgotten to put on silent. More comments on motivation for choosing a solution. I think this is pretty obvious, really. You might choose a certain solution because it was closer, or because it was more natural, or because it was good for readability, or because you thought it was better style, or better effect, or because it compensated something that you'd done somewhere else. Those are obvious, I think. Nobody needs to think about those too much because they're obvious. But have you thought that some of your solutions might be influenced by either your personal ideology or your client's ideology? Now, this is quite an interesting point. Excuse me, if that is me, I will do something. It is, yes. All right, let's put it off. Sorry. Okay. It's about my flight tomorrow. It's probably cancelled or something. Never mind. Okay. So, are there solutions which actually are ideologically motivated? And if so, are we aware of this? And I refer here to some very interesting research by a Scottish scholar, or a scholar who works in Edinburgh, Ian Mason, who studied translations in the European Parliament. Now, you'd think that in the European Parliament, everything is completely neutral. As you know, there are no source languages and no target languages, and all languages are the same, and no language is better than any other language. Right? Yes. Well, he found some interesting data, and he looked at what happened to certain texts which went from English into French. And in this text, you notice that there have been changes in the pronouns, for example, here. If you know, you can probably guess, you can see what the French, I'll translate the French in a moment if French is not one of your languages. But basically what's happening here is that there are very simple structural changes going on. So the we disappears and it becomes more neutral. Now, Mason argues that if we find patterns like this in shifts, in changes, in solution choices, it may be to reflect either the translator's own view or his client's view. Now, if you're translating into French, on the one hand, from English, in the EU, on the one hand, of course, your client is the EU. You're working for the EU. You're being paid by the EU. But it's also true to say that you are translating for the French public. And you are probably also told that your translation has to reflect the official French view of whatever policy the text is about. And Mason argues that here, in the English, which he takes to be the source language, you have an ideological position where the English contingent, the English-speaking group, are behind a policy. We're going to do this, and we will do that, and we're going to do this, and we're going to solve this problem. And it's all we. Not French we, but we, English we, all right? But it appears from this that the French delegation has been rather more critical of this policy. And the French don't want to stand behind it. So the French are not saying, we are going to put into practice this and this. So they make it into the verb, how to put into practice. And the we has disappeared. Or some public services must be closed, say the French. Not we must close some public services. So the French are kind of distancing themselves from the policy. Now, if that happened once or twice, you wouldn't think anything of it. But if you find a pattern, if you find that this goes right through the document, 40 pages, and you've got 27 examples, and they all go in this direction, that the English we becomes the French somebody is going to do something, you begin to get suspicious, right? And you begin to think maybe there's a difference here which is being introduced probably deliberately, either because the translator, him or herself, disagrees with the policy, or because he knows that the French government doesn't actually quite agree with this policy, but has to sign it, has to go along with it. Now that's quite interesting. And there are other examples of this sort of research showing the importance of looking for patterns of solutions. Patterns of solutions may have effects which are not intended, and they may reveal things which were not intended to be revealed. So, let's close with some general sort of conclusions. For the translator, when you hit a bump, when you get stuck or you have your hiccup, then it seems to me that there are some questions that you clearly have to ask. So what are the possible solutions? You have to know. You have to know whether some solutions have unwanted effects, that you would therefore not choose them. You have to know how much effort you think it's worth investing in finding a solution, and you have to know on what criteria you would suggest that you'd find the best one, because the criteria would also depend on the text type and how much time you have and so on. But for the scholar, it's a bit different. The questions that the scholar would ask when we arrive at a bump would be a bit different. A scholar might immediately ask, what were the shadow translations, I wonder? Now, a shadow translation is a term which we use to describe the possibilities that the translator could have chosen but did not choose. They remain in the shadows. What did he choose from? Now, we could find out a little bit of this by if we have a text which has been translated, shall we say, 20 times by 20 different translations, because they would probably all be different. And so you have a whole range of possible translations, and you can assume, perhaps, that all these possible ones, or most of them, would have occurred to translators. Why did they choose what they chose? We're interested in how did the translator make the decision? So then you might try to, well, how did we find out? How could we find out how the translator did come to that conclusion? And we could use various research techniques. We could do an interview. We could study drafts, different versions that the translator might have made. What did he write first, and then cross out, and then change? We might, if we had been doing this as he was working, we might have made him talk as he was translating. A think aloud protocol, TAP, is when you have translators translating, and all the time as they translate, they are talking aloud, murmuring to themselves. You have to learn to do this. Maybe you do already, do you? How many of you talk aloud when you translate? Here I go, yes, there's something, yes, I go, oh shit, I got that wrong. Now what do I do this? Oh, I had that yesterday, now what the hell was it? And you mumble, 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 mumble away to yourself, right? Do you do that? Some of you? Well, researchers find this quite interesting, because if we can hear you mumbling, maybe we can then make some inferences about what might be going on in your head. And maybe we can combine this with translog. Translog is a technology which allows us to record every single thing you do with your fingers on the keyboard. Okay? So we can see everything you've pressed, and we can see everything you've looked at on the screen. And we can probably even, nowadays, we can hook up your eyes. Well, not, sorry, I'll say that again. We can put a camera in front of your eyes, and we can record where your gaze is focused on the screen. We do that, and we find where you focus a lot and where you skip along to somewhere else and you stop there, then you go back up there, because nobody reads like this. You read like this, as you probably know, all over the place, all the time. It's quite wonderful how people read. And if we use all this technology, maybe this also gives us a window into why you decided on this solution. That's what the scholars would like to do, and do. And then there might be other scholars who would like to know how people would react to the solution that you've chosen. They might do tests with different readers to see whether readers stopped reading or had to pause, or how their eye movements changed when they arrived at your particular solution at that point. Did their eyes go like this, or did they just read on smoothly, or whatever? So we're interested in studying how solutions can be received, reception studies, by different sorts of readers. And we would also like to know whether the particular bump that the translator had was a personal problem, because he's terrible with this particular problem. He doesn't know how to use a dictionary or whatever it might be. Or is it a shared problem? Some people make a distinction between what is a difficulty, something subjective, something particular to a particular translator. You're simply not very good at this particular bit or this particular skill, or something you're hopeless with mathematical terminology, for example. Or is it a shared problem, which many translators seem to have a bump at this point? That's interesting for us, scholars. one of the problems that comes up is when the scholar becomes a critic. And the critic finds that the translator has done something really stupid. And here you have quite interesting attitudes. Scholars find this quite difficult because if we are going to be an objective, critical scholar, you have to find a good way of saying that solution there is really terrible. But it's difficult to do that without appearing to be the prescriptive teacher. And you are supposed to know best. But if we are trying to be descriptive and objective, we have to find a way of doing this. And I imagined some questions and answers here. So the critic might say, that's a terrible solution. I really don't think that's very good. I could think of a better solution, and here it is. Now, it would be wonderful if translation critics always proposed their better version for the things that they don't like. But they don't always do this, because they don't often understand the first language, of course. But a good critic, I think, would be able to propose a better solution. And then we can argue which is better. But the descriptive scholar would then say, well, why do you think that your solution is better, Mr. Critic? If the critic has found something which he thinks is terrible. And then an argument would develop on the criteria that could be used. And we can have an academic debate about which is better, on what criteria. Then the critic might say, well, it's completely wrong, it's an error. It's a clear error. How could the translator do that? But a descriptive scholar probably won't say that because it would be rude. And we're not supposed to be judging these poor translators. We are supposed to be studying. Remember, the descriptive scholar is down here, and the translators are up there, and we are admiring and wondering how they do this wonderful thing called translating. We don't want to start shooting them down. So the descriptive scholar then probably says, well, I wonder what the effects of this solution would be. I agree, it looks a bit strange. I wonder what the effects would be here. On whom? For example, if we look at the French translator that we just looked at in the EU Parliament, getting rid of all the we pronouns, the critic might say, this is all wrong, it distorts the message. But the descriptive scholar would say, interesting. I wonder who would notice this and what effect this would have on them. After all, you are a critic. You are not a typical reader, are you? You are looking for mistakes, aren't you, Mr. Critic? What about the typical readers? And who are they? And can we find some, please? I'd like to do a questionnaire with 100 typical readers, what they think of this. That's what the descriptive scholar would say. And the very polite descriptive scholar probably says something like this. This solution is puzzling. You see something, the translator's obviously made a complete cock-up somewhere, but you can't say that. Very puzzling solution here, yes. I can't actually see, I don't know why he chose it. I wonder if it was deliberate, or perhaps it was a slip. Let's ask. Now, this is an interesting research technique which some people have used to make a distinction between a slip and an error. You find something really stupid, you are the polite scholar, and you take it to the translator and you say, hey, you've put 23 here. I think in the German here it says 24. It doesn't say 23, it says 24. And the translator says, oh, shit, yeah, I'll change it. My mistake. Now, if that's the case, then we have an example of a slip. Okay, the translator realizes he's made a mistake and will change it. But in other cases, the translator might say, not in that example, but in some other kind of examples, suppose we say, in Finnish, often people go and have a coffee, where in English they might go and have a cup of tea. Okay? So a text might say in Finnish, they went for a coffee, and the translator would have said tea. And the nasty critic would have said, actually, don't you know that kahvi means coffee? Kahvi doesn't mean tea, it means coffee. You got this wrong. And the translator might say, well, actually no, because I know kahvi means coffee. I have been working as a translator for 30 years, and I do speak quite good English. I know it means coffee. But I think that in my case, tea would be more appropriate culturally, and I've adapted it for this purpose. And wherefore, in other words, he would defend his choice. And he might indeed defend his choice by using the kind of terminology which we have discussed. he might say this is an adaptation, or this is a whatever word Anthony Pym had, cultural something. If he can't change it, well, if we can't talk about it, maybe if he's dead, then what can we do? Then the polite scholar might say, let's see if we can find some other cases, see if we can find a pattern, and so on. If you read the literature on the way translation scholars deal with errors, it's quite interesting, because some of them fall over backwards in order not to be rude. So an interesting and puzzling solution is sort of polite jargon for total cock-up here. All right. Now, this is what I talked about yesterday a bit, these universals, which I won't go through them all again today, because they were the subject listed. That is to say, scholars would be interested to know whether certain solution types became so general that they became a very, very widespread tendency, which made something typically different. And I think teachers might also like to know about those, and indeed translators. Because if you know that there is a certain tendency to do X, and if you yourself would rather not do X, having learnt about it, you can then take steps not to do it. If you can take steps to resist the tendency. And then we get to the universals, which I won't repeat all that now. So, last slide, except for the reference. Questions for you. I invite comments and questions now. Do you find any of these typologies useful? Do you have your own list of solution types? That's what I didn't ask before, which I might be interested to hear now. Do you have some kind of systematic approach that you use to solve problems? And if so, what is it? Are you taught a systematic approach? Whether you are training still at university or whether you're working for an agency, is there a policy? A house policy that you are supposed to follow, like the notice we had on the wall at the beginning today? So three choices. Do you share your insights about solutions or solution types so that they become concepts that other people can use, so that they become tools that other people can use as well? And are there any typical problems? So anybody like to comment on any of those questions? Now would be a good time to open for discussion for 5 minutes or so. So the floor is open. Any of those questions or any other questions that might be in your mind after this talk? Yes, please.
So a question about those typologies. I wonder if the authors, when they came up with those typologies, if they were thinking about particular text types or if they meant their typologies to be universal and
they were
to be
not
applied.
Thinking about text types, no. They meant them to be universal.
So
I can say that, yes.
They were thinking that their typologies might be applied to EU texts, yes, as well as to literary texts.
Certainly, yes.
Okay.
Of course, they might be quite wrong, but that's what they would be thinking. Yes, I agree. I mean, yes, yes, they would be. I don't think anybody has been setting up such typologies for one particular text type. I mean, there are specialists in legal translation and so on, but that's a rather different issue, more terminological and rhetorical. That would be different. Yes, they are supposed to be general with respect to text type and general with respect to language.
I had another question about this compensation solution in literary texts. Well, isn't it from on one hand that you're losing your you're not being very loyal to the author of the literary text, because when you explicitate something, you move away a bit from the original text, and then you choose to compensate your explicitation in one place with the implicitation in another place, but then you move from the original text even further because you make more changes.
Interesting question. I think that would mean a discussion of what's meant by loyalty. In my particular case, I felt that I had certainly the right to do that. I happen to know the author, and he gave me some freedom to do things. But I think it's partly a question of what you mean by loyalty, how you interpret loyalty. We're back to conceptual hypotheses that we had yesterday. Loyal to what aspect of the text, and so on. To what extent are you also loyal to the readers? If you produce a text which is very closely translated, but which readers will find unnatural or too explicit, then you may be loyal to the author or to the text, but not loyal to the reader's expectations. There may be a conflict. But I think it also depends on the attitude of the author to translations, because here there are huge differences. Some authors, we're talking now about literature, okay? So some authors give their translators a great deal of freedom and encourage the translator to be free. Other authors, and a very good example, an extreme example is Kundera, are famous for being extremely demanding. So Kundera, if it will say, "You've moved one of my commas. How dare you? I put that comma in. This is a universally valid stylistic judgment to have a comma here." And if you say, "Yes, but in English, we don't put commas there. I want a comma there because it's in Czech that we had it there." Or actually French, because he writes in French these days. Anyway, in the language of the original, there's a comma, therefore you must have a comma. And he thinks that any change made by the translator, any of the changes listed in any of these typologies, he would condemn, because he wants the translation to be absolutely literal. And he doesn't seem to understand that although such a translation would respect the structure of his original, the effect of that, the stylistic effect of that on the new readers would be completely different, because it would sound complete garbage in English if you simply put all the commas where he puts commas, for example. I mean, the comma example I have invented. But the attitude is something that I think he has very little understanding of how translation works. I pick him as an example because I have studied his views and actually written something about his view. I have disagreed firmly with his view of translation. I think translators should have more freedom, and they should be trusted to use their own expertise. So it would depend a bit on the author. There. Good question, though. Loyalty is an important ethical issue. Has been much discussed and much disagreed with. Yes, it's an area where it's difficult to find complete agreement and difficult to find facts. You find opinions and arguments, and which are either good, convincing, or not convincing, depending on what you think. Any other points? Anybody like to raise?
Well, can I have my third question?
Well, yeah, if nobody
or
else has
a
anything
comment,
else. Okay.
maybe. It's about the particular example where you had this English and French EU text translation with those wee changes. And I was thinking maybe the change was made not because of some political or ideological aspects, but maybe because it sounds more natural in French language.
Yes,
I was thinking also about Latvian. I don't think we would write mēs,
yes.
but we would make it more neutral too.
It's a very good point, and it's a point that has been made against Mason's interpretation, that this is actually formal French, and that there's a difference in formality expectations. Formal French tends to be very impersonal, but in English we have rather looser rules about how you can write formally. So yes, it's possible that it is purely a linguistic thing and therefore not much choice. But even so, even if it is a linguistic thing, that French prefers not to use personal pronouns in formal language, at least to me it seems that there is nevertheless a different attitude behind the text, whether you hide the pronouns or don't hide them. Even though it may be a French convention, that they're not so acceptable, nevertheless, when you look at the texts, you get a different feeling about the attitude behind the text. Are we doing this? Is my government behind it, or is my government distancing itself from it? So they might not be completely in opposition, these two interpretations, but it's a good point that you've made. It has been made, yes. I didn't mention it as I talked, but yes, it's a fair point. Okay. Well, let's call it a day then. Again, thank you very much for your attention. You've been a very good and interesting audience. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. That's the reference. Will come out next year.
And very entertaining as well.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much for sharing.
All right. Thank you for inviting me.